For most people, silence is just the absence of noise. For me, it was salvation. After retiring from the Army and losing my wife to breast cancer within the same year, I packed everything I had into a trailer and drove until the pavement ended. I needed space, not just from people, but from the ache of living. That's how I ended up on a 38-acre patch of rugged land in the high desert of Arizona. No neighbors, no streetlights, no sidewalks or curbs, just wind, rock, sun, and me. I built everything from scratch. A single-story Adobe-style cabin, solar panels laid out like sun-thirsty petals on the south side, a rainwater collection system feeding into filters I installed myself. The land gave me more than I ever thought possible. It asked for work and sweat in return, but it never lied. It didn't judge. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Every morning, I woke with the sun. My dog, Boone, a mutt with more loyalty than most men I'd served with, greeted me at the door with his tail wagging. I'd walk down to the small greenhouse, check the water tanks, rotate the compost, and tend to my rows of tomatoes, onions, and peppers. In the evenings, I'd watch the sunset over the distant cliffs while sipping strong coffee I'd ground by hand. That was my religion: quiet, effort, patience. I hadn't always been that kind of man. I'd known chaos intimately. As a former communications officer, I'd seen things that rewired my brain. The screaming under radio silence, the sound of a satellite dish cracking under enemy fire, the echo of a voice you'd never hear again. Coming home didn't fix me. Therapy helped, but it was this land, the sweat equity, the rebuilding that made me whole again. For 3 years, I lived in peace. I didn't need much. I bartered with locals for meat and grains, ran my own generator when needed, and stayed off the grid in every sense of the word. Occasionally, I'd go into town for parts or medicine. People recognized me as the ranch guy or the off-grid veteran, but they left me alone. And I liked it that way. So when I saw that envelope pinned to my front gate one dry Tuesday morning in May, I felt a ripple in the stillness. It was out of place, too crisp, too official. Boone sniffed it like it carried a disease. I pulled it down and turned it over. Everline Hills HOA was stamped in bold at the top. HOA, I furrowed my brow. That couldn't be right. My land sat a good 3 miles outside the bounds of Everline Hills. I knew because I'd done my homework before I bought the place. There was no governing body, no municipal water, no oversight. That was the point. That was the whole point. Still, I opened the envelope, my thumb slicing clean through the adhesive. Inside was a folded letter printed in a typeface that screamed arrogance. Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your property includes structures and environmental features that are inconsistent with Everline Hills' community aesthetic standards. Specifically, unapproved solar installations visible from the Eastern Access Trail, a non-conforming greenhouse that may impact local wildlife migration, unauthorized water collection and irrigation methods. You are hereby notified to attend a compliance hearing on June 5th at the Everline Hills Community Hall. Failure to appear may result in administrative action. Regards, Everline Hills HOA Compliance Board. I stared at the letter for a full minute. Then I laughed, out loud. Boone barked once, startled. They think they can regulate me, I muttered, crumpling the paper in my hand. But that laugh, it didn't last. 2 days later, I noticed a drone hovering over my property. Not a kid's toy, either. It was one of those higher-end quadcopters with a gimbal camera, hovering like a silent mosquito above my greenhouse. I stood there watching it, arms crossed. Then I waved. The next morning, another letter appeared, this time in red ink. Words like non-compliance, potential fines, and demolition jumped off the page like threats. I drove into town and asked the county assessor to show me the latest zoning maps. What I saw made my jaw tighten. Everline Hills had submitted an application to extend its jurisdictional boundary, citing community expansion and environmental management. The ink was barely dry. They were trying to swallow my land whole, and I knew exactly why. It wasn't about the view or the aesthetics or even the solar panels. It was about control. Some pencil-pushing board members with too much time and not enough sense wanted to turn every inch of this canyon into a matching cul-de-sac. And my ranch with its rough-hewn edges and unpermitted freedom didn't fit the brochure. I had fought against tyranny in other countries. I never expected to fight it in my own backyard. But when you live off-grid, every inch of land, every drop of water, every screw, and every hinge is earned. And I wasn't about to roll over. They thought I was just some old hermit with a dog and a shovel. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I'd spent years learning systems, infrastructure, supply chains, water tables, radio frequencies. And when someone threatens your home, you don't just fight back. You study the map, you find the fault line, and you wait. A week passed after the drone sighting, and I hoped naively that the HOA's antics would blow over. Maybe someone on the board had gotten overzealous, misread the zoning lines, or simply picked the wrong battle. I figured they'd realize I wasn't part of their jurisdiction and back off. That's the thing about people who crave control. They usually don't have the stamina for resistance. But this time, I miscalculated. It was early morning when I found the second envelope. Not on the gate this time, on my porch. Under a rock. That meant someone had crossed my land to place it there. No call, no knock, no permission. Just a silent intrusion. Boone was pacing inside, agitated, his ears pulled back like he knew something had been violated. The envelope was thicker than the last, embossed with a gold HOA seal, like some kind of suburban monarchy. Inside were photographs, over a dozen of them. My solar panels, my greenhouse, my rain barrels, even my outhouse, for God's sake. Each picture was labeled and dated. There was a printout of local wildlife migration maps, with red ink marking how the non-compliant greenhouse interferes with the nocturnal movement of indigenous species. I flipped to the last page, a formal warning. You are hereby informed that unless all non-compliant structures are removed within 14 days of receipt, the Everline Hills Homeowners Association will initiate action through our Environmental Integrity Task Force and local code enforcement authorities. This is your final courtesy notice. Final courtesy. That's the kind of phrase that sounds polite until you realize it's a threat in a tuxedo. I sat down on the porch bench, letter in hand, and felt the quiet around me turn into something else, something heavy. There's a kind of violation that cuts deeper than property lines. It's when someone steps into your life without invitation and tries to rearrange it. When they don't even see you as a person, just an inconvenience to be filed away. I wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of pressure. In the service, I'd seen it wielded by colonels, bureaucrats, and policymakers, people who never got their boots dirty. But out here, on my land, no one had the right. I didn't call anyone. I didn't storm into town or write an angry letter. I got up, walked into the cabin, and pulled out an old metal lockbox from the floorboard. Inside were documents: my deed, the zoning certificate, original topographic survey, and a folder marked water rights. Most people don't realize that in places like Arizona, water is everything. Not the kind that comes from the tap, but what lies underground. Aquifers, wells, springs. These are the real veins of power in the desert. Years ago, when I bought the land, I'd paid extra for full mineral and water rights. It seemed like overkill at the time, but I wasn't just buying dirt, I was buying independence. I flipped through the file looking at the well logs. My main well was deep clean. And here's the kicker, connected to a low-pressure vein that ran southeast toward Everline Hills. I hadn't thought much of it before. There was no way they tapped into that, right? But now, with the way they were escalating, something didn't sit right. I took the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into a manila envelope with a sticky note: you'll want to check your jurisdiction again. The next day, I drove into town and walked straight into the county planning office. Marcia, the clerk, had known me since I first settled. She raised her eyebrows when I asked to review the latest zoning applications. Trouble, she asked, squinting over her glasses. Let's call it curiosity, I replied. We went through the files together. And there it was, an application filed just 6 weeks prior by Everline Hills HOA to annex adjacent lands for environmental oversight. The application was pending, not yet approved, but someone had jumped the gun and assumed it would go through. Worse, there was a letter from a councilman attached strongly supporting the expansion due to concerns over unregulated land impacting the community's image and resource management. Resource management. That phrase triggered something in the back of my mind. I leaned in and asked Marcia a question I hadn't considered until that moment. Can I see the town's water infrastructure map? She blinked. Public utilities. Yep. 10 minutes later, I was looking at a laminated map that made my heart skip. The well supplying Everline Hills wasn't within town limits. It was on a privately owned tract. A tract I knew used to belong to a cattle rancher who'd passed away last winter. A tract that had recently been sold, pending title transfer. The buyer's name wasn't listed, but the parcel ID matched something I'd looked at months ago during a conversation with my lawyer about land buffering. Back then, I dismissed it as unnecessary. Now, it looked like the perfect place to draw a line in the sand. I walked out of the office, heart pounding, not from fear, but from clarity. They were trying to box me in, pressure me, break me. But they didn't know I'd spent most of my life learning how to operate inside broken systems. I didn't scream or post online or file a complaint. Instead, I called the lawyer I used to work with when I bought my ranch. "Diane," I said, "that parcel with is it still available?" She paused. "You thinking of expanding?" "No," I said, looking back at the mountains behind me. "I'm thinking of drawing a boundary that can't be crossed." And that was the moment, quiet and steel-edged, when I decided I wasn't just going to protect my land. I was going to own the ground they stood on. The attack didn't come with lawyers or judges. It came with bulldozers. I was out near the eastern ridge of my property, repairing a cracked irrigation pipe from one of the rainwater tanks, when I heard the low growl of diesel engines cutting through the morning calm. Boone was the first to react. Ear-stiff hackles raised a low growl humming from his throat. I wiped my hands on a rag and climbed the slope that overlooked my southern border. What I saw made my stomach drop. 3 large vehicles, a backhoe, a dump truck, and a flatbed had crossed onto my land. Dust trailed behind them as if they were charging into battle. Men in reflective vests marked with EH Compliance Unit were already setting up perimeter cones, and 2 more were unloading tools near my greenhouse. I didn't recognize a single face. I grabbed my phone and started recording. I was still descending the ridge when I saw them cut the lock on my greenhouse gate. One man, bald mid-40s, chewing gum like he owned the place, waved a laminated paper in the air when he spotted me. "Sir, this is authorized under HOA Directive 22B, he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Your structures have been deemed non-compliant and environmentally hazardous. We're here to remove them." "You're on private land," I shot back, the adrenaline already pulsing. "You're trespassing." "We have a permit," he repeated, not even looking me in the eye. "If you interfere, we'll be forced to notify local authorities." "I am the local authority here," I said through gritted teeth. "You have no jurisdiction outside Everline Hills." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and gave a signal. That's when I heard the greenhouse groan. They were tearing it down. Not piece by piece, but violently, like it was a condemned shack, and not the hand-built, cedar-framed structure I'd nurtured for 3 years. Glass shattered. Metal supports screeched. I watched helplessly as months of soil calibration heirloom seedlings and custom irrigation piping were reduced to rubble under careless boots. I wanted to stop them. My fists clenched, breath sharp. But I knew better. I'd seen what happened when emotions overrode strategy. Instead, I focused my phone camera on every face, every badge, every move. "Keep recording, Boone," I muttered. The dog tilted his head. "You're my witness." They didn't stop at the greenhouse. One man cut the lines to my solar array and began dismantling the supports. Another disconnected the gutter system from my rain tanks and dumped them out, claiming mosquito hazard. The rage I felt was so deep, it stopped being loud. It just simmered, steady and cold. After 30 minutes, they loaded the remnants onto the flatbed and left no signatures, no citations, no police, no warning. Just destruction. I stood in the silence that followed, surrounded by broken glass and torn polycarbonate sheets. The sun still rose, the wind still rustled the mesquite trees, but something inside me had cracked, and not in the way they'd hoped. I didn't sleep that night. I replayed the footage over and over, frame by frame. I called Diane, my attorney, and sent her everything. "This is illegal," she said immediately. "They've overstepped so far, it's laughable." "Did they present a warrant? Any official court order?" "Nothing. Just paper with a letterhead." "Good. That'll burn easier in court." We filed a cease and desist the next morning and submitted a claim for property damage with the county sheriff's office. But I knew better than to wait for justice through official channels. HOA boards were notorious for slow-walking apologies and fast-tracking overreach. I had no intention of playing defense anymore. That same afternoon, I drove down to the county land records office. I requested the latest ownership map for the tract housing the well that fed Everline Hills. The clerk looked it up and smiled faintly. "It's pending transfer." To whom I asked. Buyer requested anonymity until it clears. That buyer was me. Diane had moved faster than I expected. The well was mine, or it would be within days. I stared at the map tracing the pipeline. It flowed directly beneath the ridge that separated my land from theirs, winding underground toward their polished lawns and overwatered medians. Control. That's all HOA had ever cared about. Control of color palettes, grass length, mailbox design. Every inch regulated, coded, standardized. They built a world so tight it strangled individuality. And yet here they were, drinking from my backyard. I returned to the ranch and assessed the damage. The greenhouse was beyond repair. My rain system had been gutted. One of my solar panels was bent, its frame twisted like a broken wing. Boone followed me silently, sensing the shift in my energy. I didn't speak much. I just worked, cleaned, gathered, measured. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old trunk at the foot of my bed. Inside was a set of documents from my time in service, including one file marked Infrastructural Command Exercises, Domestic. I'd spent the last 2 years of active duty helping municipalities map disaster response protocols, particularly how to reroute or shut down utilities in cases of emergency. Water was always first. I studied the diagrams, refreshed my memory. I pulled out the specs for my well purchase. Static water level, drawdown rate, pump horsepower, backflow configuration, all there. HOA thought they'd shut me down by taking away what I'd built. But they hadn't built anything themselves. They just leached off what already existed: systems, people, land. They forgot that real power didn't come from bylaws or board meetings. It came from knowing what you owned and how deep it ran. That night, I sat under the stars, Boone at my side, the fire crackling in the pit we dug our first month out here. I poured a little whiskey into a tin cup and raised it toward the well site still hidden behind a low ridge a mile south. Here's to reclamation, I said aloud. Boone wagged his tail once. It was almost time. 2 days after the demolition, I drove into Everline Hills for the first time in over a year. Not because I missed their manicured hedges or their pastel-colored driveways, but because I needed to walk among them, understand them, learn who I was really dealing with. I parked my truck just outside the community gates. It was a Thursday morning, quiet and humid. The kind of day where everything looks calm on the surface, but you can feel a storm crawling underneath. Boone stayed in the cab. He didn't like it there any more than I did. Everline Hills was a strange place, beautiful in a sterile catalog kind of way. Every house looked like the next. Each lawn was trimmed to military standards, every porch adorned with matching seasonal wreaths. But under that calm, I felt the tension of people walking on a tightrope of rules, smiles stretched, too tight nods, rehearsed every gesture of performance. I strolled into the community center, where a compliance meeting had just let out. People filtered out in small clusters, whispering and adjusting their lanyards. I stood at the bulletin board in the lobby, pretending to browse while my ears did the real work. That off-grid guy finally got a notice. Greenhouse had non-native plants, they said. Should have known better living that close to us. The tone wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was indifferent. They didn't even see me as a person. Just a line on a map they didn't like. A smudge in their perfect landscape. But there was something else too, an undertone of uncertainty. Water pressure dropped again this morning. No answer from utilities. We've been paying extra for infrastructure fees. Now that got my attention. I leaned in toward one of the community maps on the wall, color-coded property zones, HOA jurisdictions, and an inset showing utilities. There it was. Well site number 3, primary water intake. A tiny blue dot just beyond the southern boundary. My land. They didn't know. Not yet. The transfer hadn't posted. Legally, I didn't own the well until the county updated the register. But it was only a matter of time, and I had no intention of giving them advance notice. Instead, I returned to my truck, pulled out the black notebook I kept in the glove compartment, and started making a list. Phase 1 assessment. I contacted a former colleague from my Army days, Marcus Lane, a hydro engineer who now did freelance assessments for rural water systems. He owed me a favor. Within 48 hours, he was standing at the edge of my new property with a laptop, a drill sensor, and a grim smile. Your well's solid, he confirmed. Pump system's decades old, but functioning. And it's the only viable source on this aquifer, for miles. And Everline Hills, I asked. Hooked directly into it. No backup, no redundancy. Whoever approved this setup was either naive or cocky. They were HOA board members, I said. Marcus grinned. So cocky then. He showed me how to install a new control valve, one I could regulate independently. If I wanted, I could reduce their flow to a trickle without technically cutting them off. Just maintenance, I'd say. Testing, safety checks, phase 2 evidence. Before I made a move, I wanted everything documented. I placed hidden cameras near the perimeter of both properties in case anyone from the HOA tried anything stupid again. I had Diane draft letters to the Water Management Office, informing them of the ownership change and requesting a formal inspection of the pipeline's wear and legal compliance. In parallel, I submitted a Freedom of Information request for the HOA's expansion documents. I wanted to know how far they'd gone and how many lies they'd stacked to get there. 2 weeks later, the documents arrived, and they were a goldmine. Emails between board members showed that they'd known the well sat outside their legal boundaries. One message from the president, a woman named Cheryl Keaton, read, "We'll move forward with annexation regardless. Once the land is absorbed, we'll secure access to the water source permanently." It wasn't just about regulations. It was about acquisition. They'd planned to erase my land off the map and drink my water while smiling in their pastel blazers. They were playing a slow game, but I was patient and thorough. Phase 3 leverage. The day the title cleared, I drove into town and had it notarized. Then I waited until Friday trash collection day in Everline Hills. The perfect moment when homeowners were all outside, checking bins, exchanging gossip, admiring how tightly their neighbors had tied their garbage bags. I wore jeans and a flannel shirt, boots, dusty from the well site, and carried one envelope, just one. I walked up to the community center steps and pinned it to the bulletin board with a thumbtack. Then I stepped back and took a photo. Inside that envelope was a formal notification. As of July 1st, all water flow from the well located on parcel 148D is subject to private maintenance. Intermittent service disruptions may occur. Please direct all inquiries to the landowner. I signed it with my full name. Then I left. The next morning, I woke to 26 missed calls. 4 voicemails from EH Compliance Office, 2 emails from Cheryl Keaton, and 1 from the city's Water Regulation Board requesting a meeting. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I walked out to the well. Marcus had helped me install the control panel, a small gray box bolted to a steel post. Inside, 3 simple switches controlled the intake output and pressure regulation. I flipped the middle switch. The valve hissed. The flow slowed. Not a shutoff, just enough to create a problem. The HOA had declared war by tearing down what I'd built. They just hadn't realized. I'd been studying their foundation all along. By the time the first official complaint hit my inbox, I was already 4 feet into the ground. Not metaphorically. Literally. I had a spade in my hand and dirt up to my elbows. The area around the well hadn't been properly maintained in years. I wanted to know what lay beneath before they tried to tell me what I did or didn't own. The land around the well was rocky, but not unfriendly. That's the thing about the desert. It doesn't resist you unless you disrespect it. I knew how to work with it. It had taught me patience, and now it was rewarding me with answers. I found the secondary valve line first buried in a loose gravel bed about 3 feet down. A rusted tag dangled from it, installed date 1996. The HOA had been drinking through this pipe for almost 3 decades, thinking it was theirs. At 5 feet, I found the older pipe, cast iron, corroded and capped. This must have been the original line before they rerouted the system. Why it was capped, I didn't know yet. But I'd find out. I didn't dig just for water, I dug for history. Once I unearthed what I needed, I contacted Marcus again. "Bring your drone," I told him. When he showed up that Sunday, the sky was a hard blue with no clouds in sight. He launched the drone from the tailgate of his truck, and within minutes, we had a high-resolution top-down view of everything: my ranch, the HOA development, the access roads, and most importantly, the underground path of the water lines. He used a sensor array to map electromagnetic signals through the pipes. "There's a split in the line about 20 yards south of your wellhead," he said, pointing at the screen. "Looks like a junction that was never logged in the HOA records." He scrolled through the overlay and smiled. "They're pulling water through an old lateral that shouldn't even be active. My guess, someone reactivated it during HOA expansion without updating the utility office, which meant they were in technical violation of both state water code and local zoning bylaws. That was the moment the chessboard opened in my mind. I saw every square, every piece, every potential move, and I'd barely begun. I spent the rest of that week pulling old permits, county archives, water rights applications. I even paid a visit to the oldest guy in town, Frank Delaney, former water commissioner, and the only man who still kept paper maps in a metal drawer in his garage. I always told him not to touch that damn lateral, he said, sipping iced tea from a mason jar. But HOA wanted more lawns, more fountains. Said the new folks liked it lush. He showed me a document from 2002 hand-signed by the then president of the HOA. It acknowledged that the lateral pipe had been closed due to insufficient easement permissions and inconsistent jurisdictional clarity. Fancy words for, we don't own this. I photographed the paper. I now had documentation proving they had knowingly tied into a water system they didn't legally control. That was enough to start a process most HOAs dread more than anything: a municipal audit. I drove to the city council office and requested a public utilities meeting. When they asked why I handed over a neatly compiled folder with evidence photos and a summary statement. This isn't about revenge, I told the clerk. It's about safety. Misuse of water resources affects everyone. She blinked a little stunned. And you're the landowner, I said simply, and the new well controller. 2 days later, the HOA sent someone to knock on my door. It was a man in khakis and a golf shirt, Greg Stanton, vice president of Everline Hills HOA. He came bearing a bottle of mid-shelf wine and a folder of printed talking points. Boone barked the moment Greg stepped out of his car. "Mr. Lane," Greg said, extending a hand. "Mind if I come in?" "I do," I said. "You can say what you need to say from there." He cleared his throat and smiled like a man trying to be polite while his house is on fire. "We'd love to discuss a mutual agreement regarding water management," he began. "There's been some confusion, and the board feels that cooperation would benefit both parties." "Your men tore down my greenhouse," I said, "destroyed my rain systems, and now you want to cooperate?" Greg shifted. "We were acting on compliance reports. Illegally," I cut in. "I've filed claims. I've got documents going back 20 years. Your lateral line shouldn't be live. You're diverting municipal-level water without authority." He licked his lips, caught off guard. "We'd be willing to compensate you for access." "I'm not interested in compensation," I said. "Then what do you want?" I didn't answer immediately. I just looked at him. Not with anger, but with the kind of calm that made him fidget. "What I want," I said, "is for people like you to understand that not every inch of land is yours to claim. That freedom still exists outside your bylaws. That the world doesn't need your fences, or your flower beds, or your fake smiles." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down, adjusted his clipboard, and turned back toward his car. "Have a good day, Mr. Lane," he said. "You already ruined one," I replied. "Don't try for another." When he left, I walked back to the well and ran a test on the pressure valve. Just enough output to keep their systems confused, fluctuating pressure, no solid reason why. It wasn't sabotage. It was instruction. They had tried to erase me, bulldoze me, drown me in red tape. But what they didn't know was that I'd already dug deeper than they ever would into the land, into the law, and into the weakness of systems built on arrogance. And I wasn't finished. The county clerk's voice on the phone was nearly trembling with politeness. "Mr. Lane," she said, "just confirming that parcel 148D is now officially recorded under your name. All mineral and water rights included. Congratulations." "Thank you," I replied, steady. I didn't need to celebrate. This wasn't a victory parade. It was a move on the board, one I had waited weeks, months, really to execute. I hung up and stood in the middle of the ridge, overlooking the well, the wind picking up just enough to tug at the brim of my hat. From where I stood, I could almost see the tops of Everline Hills' stucco roofs in the distance, glinting under the sun like a row of smug smiles. They had no idea that as of that moment, I didn't just own the pipeline. I owned their lifeline. I didn't rush. There was no need. Control wasn't about power grabs. It was about timing. That same afternoon, I filed 2 additional legal notices. The first was a use audit request with the Arizona Water Resources Department demanding a review of Everline Hills' draw levels and compliance history. The second was a usage clarification letter addressed directly to the HOA. informing them that their continued use of the lateral line now constituted trespass through subterranean property. It was a calm, measured warning. Just a note to say, "You're drinking from my glass now. Best to ask first." The next week unfolded like a slow, pleasant storm. It began with reports of brown water trickling from HOA taps. Residents started calling the water department, then the HOA. Complaints of fluctuating pressure, odd tastes, air bubbles. No one quite knew what was wrong. The HOA sent out their usual form letter reassurance, routine maintenance. No cause for concern. But inside the boardroom, panic was brewing. I knew because Marcia, my quiet ally, at the county office slipped me a transcript of their emergency meeting. They were scrambling desperately, trying to get answers from their utilities contractor. "Nothing's changed on our end," one tech had told them. "Unless someone's tampered with the line, this isn't on us." It wasn't tampering, it was ownership. Marcus and I had installed a regulatory flow gate 2 days earlier, completely within legal bounds. It was a safety valve, we claimed. A necessary update to prevent overuse and mitigate erosion near the aquifer. Perfectly reasonable. But what it really did was give me full control of output volume. I could let the water rush or slow it to a crawl, and I chose the latter. I didn't shut off their water. That would have made me the villain. I simply made it unreliable. And in a neighborhood like Everline Hills, where the sprinklers must chirp at 7 a.m. sharp and the community pool must shimmer like a brochure, unreliable wasn't tolerable. One weekend, I received a letter from Cheryl Keaton, the president of the HOA. "Dear Mr. Lane, we understand there may have been confusion regarding the water infrastructure and usage rights affecting both your property and the Everline Hills development. In the interest of community harmony and sustainable cooperation, we propose a monthly easement fee in exchange for continued use of the existing line. We believe this can be a mutually beneficial relationship and would welcome a discussion. Respectfully, Cheryl Keaton, President Everline Hills, HOA." I folded the letter and placed it in my drawer unopened. Let them wonder. Let them sweat. You see, they didn't just underestimate me, they misunderstood me. They thought I'd want money, that I'd be bought off with a monthly check and some shallow smiles at town hall. But I wasn't fighting for profit. I was fighting for your dignity, for freedom, for a piece of land no one could take from me again. The next morning, I drove into town and met Diane at the diner. "You ready?" she asked, sliding over a folder. "Hit me." She handed me a proposal, a new deed restriction, on the well legally binding and publicly recorded, stating that no party may access or draw from the aquifer through any lateral or surface connection without explicit renewed annual permission from the landowner. I signed it. Now it wasn't just ownership. It was perpetual leverage. Diane grinned. "You know they're going to call a press conference." "Good," I said. "Let them." That same afternoon, I installed a new sign at the fence line of Parcel 148D. It read, "Private property. No access without written consent. Water rights enforced under ARS 45-141. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I didn't need to say more. That night, I sat on my porch with Boone curled at my feet. The stars were sharp above us, the air still. For the first time since this began, I felt something settle inside me. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, but control hard won and clean. They had torn down what I built, but in trying to erase me, they exposed the foundation they stood on. And I bought it. The sun rose on Everline Hills like it always did, golden perfect, oblivious. Lawns began their timed sprinkler rituals. Joggers bounced down the sidewalks in coordinated outfits. The pool filters kicked in with a hum. Everything worked until it didn't. At precisely 7:42 a.m., a curious thing happened. Showers turned cold halfway through. Faucets sputtered. The community fountain in front of the welcome sign coughed and drained into silence. The HOA's irrigation systems began blinking red, low pressure detected. Confusion spread faster than the outage itself. Inside the boardroom, I imagined Cheryl Keaton blinking at a spreadsheet, while Greg Stanton frantically refreshed his email searching for a notice that would explain the sudden lapse. But there wasn't one. No construction alert. No repair crew. No storms or weather warnings. Just silence. And my name on the deed. I didn't shut off their water completely. That would have made me an easy villain. No, I choked the flow to a whisper barely enough to fill a bottle per household. Legally, I was performing a flow calibration. The well was old, I explained. Stress tests were needed. Output rates had to be adjusted to prevent collapse of the aquifer. After all, sustainability was everyone's responsibility, wasn't it? By 10 a.m., the HOA's emergency line was backed up with residents demanding answers. I can't get water to make formula for my baby. My lawn is browning. I paid a $400 infrastructure fee this month. Why is nothing working? Cheryl sent out a community-wide bulletin. Dear residents, we are aware of intermittent water service disruptions. Our contractor has assured us the issue is temporary. Please conserve water and stay tuned for further updates. It was a stall tactic. I knew it, and so did they. Around noon, I received the first direct phone call from the HOA office. I let it ring. At 2:13 p.m., another letter was couriered to my gate. This time it came with an envelope embossed in gold foil. I recognized the flourish, an old negotiation trick meant to project diplomacy. Inside, Mr. Lane. Given the sudden technical challenges surrounding the water supply and understanding your position as the newly recorded landowner of Well Site 3, we propose a new collaborative agreement including Walm's full repair of any damaged structures previously removed by our team, a public acknowledgement of missteps in our annexation efforts, a monthly fee of $5,000 in exchange for uninterrupted water access. We are committed to restoring peace and partnership. Please respond within 24 hours. Sincerely, Cheryl Keaton, HOA President. I placed the letter on my kitchen table next to the busted greenhouse photograph I kept as a reminder. $5,000 a month. It wasn't pocket change, but it wasn't what I was after either. I didn't want their money. I wanted their memory. A long-lasting lesson that some fences can't be moved and some people won't be pushed. That night I met Diane on a video call. Thoughts, she asked. I'm not replying yet. She nodded. Let them sweat. And if they escalate, they can't, she said confidently. Legally, you've done everything by the book. The well is yours. The water is yours. The pipeline is yours. And the restriction rock solid. I slept easy that night. They didn't. By the next morning, local news vans were parked outside Everline Hills. One reporter, a young woman named Talia Reyes, stood near the gated entrance holding a mic. We're here live, where residents of Everline Hills have been facing unexplained water shortages. The HOA has yet to release a formal statement, and sources suggest the issue may stem from a privately owned well just outside the community. She paused as a car honked behind her. We've also received anonymous tips indicating that the HOA may have overstepped legal boundaries in their use of that water source. If true, this could have serious implications for both infrastructure liability and community trust. That same day, I received a letter from the city council. They wanted to schedule a facilitated mediation between me and the HOA. On the surface, it was about water. But the subtext was clear: keep this from becoming a public disaster. I agreed, but on one condition: the meeting would be held at my property, at the well itself. Let them come to the ground they tried to claim. Let them see what they dismissed as a shack now turned symbol. And they came. 3 SUVs pulled up the next morning, tires crunching over gravel. Out stepped Cheryl in a tan blazer, Greg in a crisp white shirt, and 2 council members flanked by aides. Diane stood beside me in a sun hat and mirrored sunglasses, arms crossed. Mr. Lane, Cheryl began, voice tight. We appreciate you hosting. I motioned toward the folding chairs we'd set up near the well. Boone sat nearby, calm but alert. The discussion began like most formal negotiations terms, tone guarded civility. But as they outlined their recovery strategy, I interrupted. I don't want your money. They froze. Then what do you want? Greg asked. I want 3 things, I said. First, public acknowledgement. Not just to me, but to every homeowner you've ever strong-armed into silence. Cheryl blinked. Second, I continued, you withdraw the annexation request and never submit another without unanimous approval from adjacent landowners. And the third, asked a council member. I looked them square in the eye. You rebuild my greenhouse, every bolt, every glass panel, just as it was. There was silence. Cheryl looked as if she might protest, but Greg surprisingly nodded. We'll draft it, he said. That afternoon, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. A statement was posted on their website by dusk. We, the Everline Hills Homeowners Association, formally apologize for recent oversteps in our jurisdictional boundaries and acknowledge the property rights of Mr. Lane, owner of Parcel 148D. We remain committed to rebuilding trust through transparency and respect. And just like that, the water returned. But I didn't open the valve all the way. I let it trickle up slowly like forgiveness. They had to earn it. The ripple effect didn't stop with the apology. Over the next week, the residents of Everline Hills began to ask questions, real ones. For the first time since the community was founded, the HOA inbox was flooded with demands for transparency. Who approved the annexation attempt? Why wasn't the HOA paying for its own water supply? How many other decisions had been made without informing the people who actually live there? Cheryl tried to spin it in their newsletter. She framed it as a misunderstanding with a local landowner that had since been resolved. But that phrase, a misunderstanding, was a slap in the face to anyone who had seen the footage, now circulating online videos, of their HOA compliance unit tearing down a greenhouse neighbors, showing brown tap water pouring from kitchen sinks, and Talia Reyes's report connecting it all to a man who simply wanted to be left alone. That man was me. I didn't post those videos, but I knew who did. Marcia, at the county, had a nephew who edited footage for fun. Diane had leaked just enough to keep reporters interested. And Marcus, well, he'd always been a bit of a chaos agent when it came to bad bureaucracy. The media had a new angle. The veteran who bought the water supply. I'd walk into town and strangers would nod at me, shake my hand, buy me coffee. You really stuck it to him, one local said. That HOA's been pushing too hard for years, said another. Glad someone pushed back. But this wasn't about revenge for me, not really. It was about drawing a boundary that meant something. That Thursday, a knock on my cabin door pulled me from my thoughts. Boone barked once. I opened it to find a woman in her 60s, silver hair, in a loose braid, wearing worn jeans and a t-shirt that read, Everline Hills Gardening Club. Mr. Lane, she asked. Yes. I'm Gloria Santos, she said. I've lived in Everline Hills for 15 years. I just wanted to say thank you. I raised an eyebrow. She smiled gently. They fined me 3 times last year for growing marigolds outside the flower bed zone. Marigolds, I asked. Too bright, they said. Inconsistent with community palate. Her smile faded. I paid the fines, but I wanted you to know. Watching you stand up for your land, it gave people like me hope. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. She handed me a tin of cookies, patted Boone on the head, and left. That night, I sat by the fire with the tin in my lap and thought about all the Glorias still living behind those white fences, afraid to speak, afraid to plant what they wanted, decorate how they pleased, live how they felt free. Everline Hills wasn't unique. It was a symptom. And maybe, just maybe, I was the fever that would break it. The next morning, Diane called. They've accepted all terms, she said. Greenhouse materials are being delivered next week. The city is withdrawing the HOA's annexation request permanently. And the water, you still own every drop. The rebuild began the following Monday. Trucks rolled in with tempered glass cedar panels and local contractors supervised by Marcus. I didn't lift a finger except to draw the original greenhouse plans from memory. I wanted it just as it was. Not out of stubbornness, but as a reminder. A living memory. Greg Stanton visited twice during the rebuild. The first time he didn't speak, just watched from a distance, hands in his pockets. The second time he approached me directly. I still think we could have worked this out quietly, he said. I wiped sweat from my brow and turned toward him. You never gave me quiet, I replied. You gave me bulldozers. He looked down, scuffed the dirt with his loafer. We lost a lot of support, he said. Cheryl might not survive the next vote. I nodded. Then maybe the next president will lead with listening. He didn't argue, just walked away. By the time the greenhouse was finished, it looked exactly as I remembered. Glass panels shimmering in the sunlight, cedar walls sealed against the elements, and a new irrigation system connected to rain barrels reinforced with metal mesh. Stronger, smarter, still mine. The HOA sent one last letter. This one was personal, handwritten by Cheryl. Mr. Lane, we were wrong. Not just about jurisdiction, but about you. I let fear and control masquerade as leadership, and I'm sorry. You didn't just protect your land. You reminded this community that boundaries matter. Respectfully, Cheryl Keaton. I kept the letter tucked behind the new building permit framed on the greenhouse wall. Because forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, only understanding. The drought season came early that year. Everline Hills struggled again. But this time the HOA turned to me before making any assumptions. They asked, not demanded, if they could purchase additional water access during the dry months. I agreed, at a fair rate, with clear terms, with respect, because power in the end isn't in the ability to say no. It's in knowing when and how to say yes. The day of the public apology felt surreal, not because I craved it, but because I never thought they'd actually follow through. It was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, 4 p.m., at the Everline Hills Community Park, an immaculately trimmed HOA-regulated patch of grass with white benches and a tiny stage that was usually reserved for wine tastings and seasonal meet and greets. This time, however, the stage would be used for something far less polished: accountability. I didn't plan to speak. I didn't even plan to attend at first. What did I care for public theater? But Diane convinced me. This isn't for you, she said. It's for everyone watching. Everyone who's ever been steamrolled by a clipboard and a rulebook. They need to see you standing there, free, calm, unbroken. So I came. I wore the same clothes I wore the day they tore down my greenhouse: faded jeans, sun-worn flannel boots caked with desert dust. Boone walked beside me, unbothered by the crowd that had gathered. Residents sat on lawn chairs or stood in clumps, most of them hushed. Some looked ashamed, others looked grateful. And then there were the cameras, local news, a few bloggers, even Talia Reyes back again with her mic and that steady investigative glint in her eye. The HOA board was already seated at the edge of the stage. Cheryl stood at the mic, a small stack of papers in her hand. She glanced at me as I arrived, then looked down at her notes. Her hands trembled slightly. "Good afternoon," she began, voice amplified across the manicured park. "As president of the Everline Hills Homeowners Association, I come before you today not to defend but to admit. Mistakes were made, serious ones. Lines were crossed, rights were ignored, and the very values this community claims to uphold, respect, neighborliness, and integrity, were violated." A murmur rolled through the crowd. She continued, "We wrongfully targeted a private citizen. We overstepped our jurisdiction. We caused harm to property, to peace of mind, and to trust. And for that, on behalf of this board, I offer a formal apology to Mr. Lane." She turned to me. For the first time, her voice cracked. "Mr. Lane, we failed you, and we failed this community by allowing our authority to replace our humanity." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was measured, cautious, but it was real. I didn't walk up to the stage. I didn't say a word. I just nodded once slowly and placed my hand over Boone's head as he sat beside me. Because I didn't need a podium. The well was mine. The land was mine. The silence I fought for was mine. After the event, people approached in waves. A young couple thanked me. They'd been fined twice for a child's inflatable pool violating uniform standards. An elderly man shook my hand and said, "I built half this neighborhood 40 years ago. Never thought I'd see someone bring it back down to earth." Even Gloria Santos returned with a single marigold bloom in hand. "For your new greenhouse," she said. "They can't find you now." The following week, things changed. Not all at once, but meaningfully. The HOA board held a public vote to revise their charter, adding clauses about property owner autonomy, mandatory consent for boundary expansion, and a new committee dedicated to mediation before enforcement. Cheryl stepped down as president. Greg declined to run again. New faces stepped forward, residents, not politicians. People who'd felt the squeeze and were tired of being quiet. Everline Hills would never be perfect, but it was healing. And me, I rebuilt my routines. Every morning I checked the water gauges, fed Boone, walked the perimeter, watered the greenhouse, now thriving with new growth, some from salvaged seeds, others gifted by neighbors who understood what that space meant. One morning, I found a letter tucked under a stone by the gate. "Mr. Lane, I live 3 streets over in Everline Hills. I've never met you, but I watched this whole thing unfold. I've got a dad like you, quiet, stubborn, honest. I just wanted to say thank you. You reminded me not all fights are loud. Yours, Erica M." I folded the letter and kept it with the others. Because while the apology was public, the victory was personal. It wasn't about humiliation or triumph. It was about presence. About standing where someone tried to erase you and saying, "I'm still here." One morning, weeks later, I drove into town to pick up more greenhouse supplies. On my way back, I saw 2 kids riding bikes along the edge of Everline Hills. One of them pointed to the ridge and said, "That's the guy who owns the water." The other nodded with wide eyes. I smiled and drove on. Because in the desert, ownership isn't about possession. It's about a stewardship, about understanding that some things, land, water, Dignity are earned and protected, not granted. And I intended to protect them. For good. The wind sounded different now, where once it carried the dull echo of violation. Steel cracking glass, shattering footsteps, stomping through a life they didn't build now, it brushed softly against the new cedar panels of my rebuilt greenhouse. It rustled through the mesquite trees, whistled past the solar panels I'd realigned, and swept down to the wellhead with a low, steady hum, as if the land itself had exhaled. I was home again. Not just geographically, but in spirit. That first morning after the final inspection, I stepped barefoot onto the porch, mug of coffee in hand, and stood there watching the sun rise over the ridge. Boone lay at my feet, blinking slow and content. Behind us, the greenhouse glowed with a new kind of warmth, one not born of sunlight alone, but of resilience, repair, and something else even more rare. Respect. You don't realize how sacred that is until someone tries to take it from you. HOA had done more than destroy a structure. They tried to erase an identity. Mine. And with it, the very idea that someone could live outside the grid beyond the lines, still whole and still proud. But what they didn't count on was the quiet strength of those who have already survived worse. I came here years ago to disappear, to find silence after loss, to bury myself in earth and sweat and solitude. And yet somehow, against my own intention, I became visible. Not by shouting, but by standing still. Rebuilding wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about trust. Each board I laid back into place. Each piece of glass I locked into the frame. Each drop of water that cycled through the new system, everything was a restoration of something they never had the power to break, only to delay. I started keeping a journal again. Not the kind filled with bitterness, but with observation. Notes about weather patterns, growth cycles, Boone's moods, the way the community kids sometimes biked past my gate, and slowed down not out of fear but curiosity. One morning, I found a hand-drawn note tucked inside my mailbox. Mr. Lane, my name is Carter. I'm 10. I want to live off-grid like you one day. My dad says you're a legend. Can I help plant something sometime? It was signed with a drawing of a tomato plant and a dog. I left a reply on the mailbox door. Only if you like pulling weeds and hauling compost. Bring your dad. A week later, Carter and his father showed up with gloves and 2 small shovels. The man, a young veteran himself, told me he'd left the HOA board shortly after the scandal broke. Couldn't do it anymore, he said. Felt like managing fear. I didn't need to say anything. We just dug side by side in silence. The new greenhouse didn't just grow vegetables. It grew connection. Gloria Santos brought marigold seeds and her stories. Frank Delaney, the retired water commissioner, gifted me his old measuring tools and taught Carter how to calibrate pH levels in soil. Even Cheryl came by once alone without makeup or ceremony, just to hand me a single bag of compost tea and say, "Thank you for holding the line." I took it without a word, because forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't announced. It's planted. It takes root slowly. It grows when no one is looking. As summer stretched across the desert and the air turned sharp with cicadas and cactus bloom, the pressure in my chest, the one I hadn't noticed, had returned, finally lifted. The rhythm of the land returned steady and clean. My days were full but quiet. My nights were soft but deep. The HOA sent quarterly updates, now co-signed by a rotation of new board members. Their tone was different, less formal, more human. They instituted listening sessions, created a volunteer board review panel, even revised their enforcement process to require majority resident vote. But I didn't attend the meetings. I didn't need to. The real work wasn't happening in those rooms anymore. It was happening out here on the edge, in the dirt. In the silence that now carried only the wind, and Boone's lazy breathing and the soft creak of cedar warming in the sun. One evening, as I closed up the greenhouse, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. Older now, wiser, but not hardened, just rooted. And I realized they could have broken me. If I hadn't remembered who I was, they could have pushed me into bitterness, into retreat, into surrender. But instead, I listened to the land. I remembered that real power doesn't raise its voice. It endures. It waits. And when the time is right, it responds. So if they ever come again, whoever they may be, trying to flatten this ridge into a sidewalk or pave over my well with rules and ribbons and reasons, they'll find me here. Boots on the ground, hand on the gate, and a quiet voice behind them whispering, "Wait, he owns the water."